So welcome everyone to Jess's defense of their thesis, and a special thanks to Timothy Littletran and Jay Swanson for being readers for Jess's thesis and doing this in record time. I don't think we've ever given anyone this little time ever, but we're both really grateful for this, given our own personal circumstances. So I'm going to pass it over to Jess and let them present.
Okay. I just wanted to echo those thanks, by the way, to Timothy and Jay. I really appreciate y'all's time and energy in this. All right. So my thesis, queer clients' experiences of harm in therapy. Let's get into it. So starting with how I came to this topic, largely in this grad program, with it being focused around sociocultural issues, it kind of just was a launching pad for me and like a journey of unlearning and becoming more aware of many things, but one of those things being like the ways that I had been perpetuating harm in my work as a music therapist, despite having had good intentions, and also considering myself someone somewhat like socioculturally informed. I think in that process, I also started realizing how much more there was to learn, but more so like the ways that no one can be fully informed on all cultures and all things, which means that harm is bound to occur. And that made me feel concerned about the lack of research or discourse I was seeing in the music therapy profession about that potential for harm. And so because of my lived experience as a visibly queer person, I decided to try and explore it through that lens. With doing my literature review, I began by looking at what has been done on queerness in music therapy. And based on what I found, to me, it was like a lot of sort of red flags for harm. There's reports of like a lack of preparedness among music therapy students and clinicians, as well as this like sort of overconfidence, where folks are describing their approach as open and affirming, but also don't have a space for people to self-identify their gender and sexuality in the documentation, or feeling unprepared to work with queer folks, but then not seeking out supervision for working with queer folks. Then I also looked at what has been done on harm. So looking outside of music therapy, there has been research done on how harm occurs in therapy, potential factors for that, what effects it has. One thing I found interesting from that research was this idea of the bias blind spot, where you can recognize a bias in someone else and still be unaware of that bias, the same bias in yourself. In music therapy, not as much has been done about harm, but there have been a few studies in recent years. Murakami created the music therapy and harm model. Norris talked about the ways that the dominance of the white lens in the music therapy discourse and devaluing of Black aesthetics rendered the harm to Black clients in a music therapy group like invisible, essentially unnamed, unacknowledged. And then McSorley has what I thought was a really beautiful study on gender microaggressions in music therapy, but that was between clinicians, students, and educators, and didn't look at the client's perspective. So then I looked at what has been done from the client's perspective. Again, going outside of music therapy, queer clients specifically have had their perspectives researched. And those studies have found that therapists tend to either over or underemphasize the queer identities, meaning all of their issues are attributed to the fact that they're queer, or the fact that they're queer is kind of like swept under the rug and ignored. The experiences of queer people tend to be universalized, and like queer people are treated as a monolith. And then queer clients also have to educate their therapists on things related to their queer identities. There has been research in music therapy about like from clients' perspectives, not queer clients specifically, but other various like settings and topics. But something else that I found myself coming into or reading about in this vein of research was like epistemic privilege, epistemic justice, and injustice. So in this article by Clive, they say that the dominantly situated knowers continue to misinterpret and misunderstand the world. So reading that, I thought about the ways that therapists are dominantly situated, one, in the therapy client power dynamic, and two, in our profession, just the demographic makeup of being mostly white, cishet, non-disabled women. So my purpose statement is here, and my research questions were, how have queer clients experienced harm in therapy? What was the therapist's behavior and attitude that caused harm? What was the effect of harm on the client and on the therapeutic relationship and process? In approaching and designing this study, I was operating from a queer standpoint epistemology. So meaning I'm assuming that we come to know what we know through a lens of cis heteronormativity among other systems of oppression, that folks have unique knowledge based on where they're located socioculturally in society, and that queer people specifically have a unique knowledge because of their existence outside of cis heteronormativity. For data collection and analysis procedures, I received IRB approval and then sent out a recruitment post to several queer organizations around the country and posted it as well in some queer music therapy Facebook groups. On the recruitment post was a link to a Google form where prospective participants could fill out demographic information. From those responses, I received 4 that met eligibility criteria, and all 4 were selected to participate. I conducted semi-structured interviews with them individually over Zoom, and then began transcribing, reading, coding for things that were significant. And in this stage of the research, I was engaging in a reflexive process of meeting with Sue regularly and dialoguing about the data, intermittent journaling, and then trustworthiness was also increased through member checking and prolonged engagement with the material. This table shows the demographic makeup of the participants. Due to the small number of responses I received, it was quite limited, particularly in regards to age and race. All that data came down to 7 themes and 25 sub-themes. And as I go through these, I'm going to be sharing quotes from participants just to help illustrate what these things actually were and continue to sort of center their voices. So the first theme was therapist responses. And a sub-theme of this was responding to who the client is. So some harm that came in that form was ignoring or minimizing people's queerness, laughing at the client or dismissing or invalidating their queerness. For example, when participant 3 shared with their therapist that they think that they might be trans, their therapist's response was, "Now, come on, you know that's not true." Folks also reported having their queer identities pathologized, and having that universalizing experience of being treated as a monolith as found in some of the other literature, and also being misgendered by their therapist. There were also responses that came as they were in response to clients bringing up a harmful incident or dynamic. And those responses ranged from expressing understanding of what had occurred to a continued lack of understanding despite the incident having been brought to the therapist's attention. The next theme is client responses, how they responded to the harmful incident. For their emotional responses, there were kind of 2 sort of subsets, one being the reaction to the therapist sort of in the moment. So examples of those were feeling betrayed, disappointed, or feeling unsafe and fearful. And then other emotions that folks talked about related to this feeling of a lack of belongingness. So this is where folks mentioned feeling unseen and unheard, and then internalizing those feelings, which participant 2 said they felt a lot of guilt and shame. Participant 1 said they felt like a delinquent. And then people also talked about it feeling unsupported by their therapist because the therapist was unequipped to be able to guide them through their experience of their queerness. Psychosomatic responses related to the kind of like physical manifestation of the harm. Examples of that was seeing red or having a sinking feeling. And then strategic responses were how clients or participants chose to navigate through the harmful encounter. So all 4 participants reported engaging in some form of advocacy. This either was through bringing the harmful incident to the therapist's attention and or educating their therapist. People also talked about engaging with community resources. So that was sometimes through leaning on your support system, engaging with other queer people, even queer people who have worked with that specific therapist before. And then also one participant talked about the reason that they educated their therapist was to act as a community resource for future queer clients working with that therapist. And then kind of in contrast to all the advocacy that was discussed, people also mentioned feeling silenced by the power dynamic in the therapy relationship. So for participant 4, they said, I just kind of clammed up. Next theme is qualities of the therapeutic relationship. It was described as being toxic, and people also mentioned that therapists were attempting to check in and solicit feedback, but that the nature of the therapeutic relationship didn't allow clients to feel safe enough to kind of respond to those check-ins authentically. Limited rapport was definitely a significant sub-theme in this section. And participant 1 kind of exemplifies it well. They say, if I'm telling you that this is a big piece of my existence and you're ignoring the creator in the room, how am I supposed to feel super comfortable with you? So folks talked about how feeling unseen or having experienced harm didn't allow for that relationship to kind of fully blossom. And then client self-protection refers to the ways that clients didn't feel safe enough to be able to engage in therapy as their whole authentic self. So participant 2 mentioned holding back certain things. Other folks talked about not being fully honest or putting up a wall. And then another significant sub-theme was how the therapy space replicates systems of privilege and oppression. So this refers to the ways that the issues that participants experienced in therapy mirrored the issues they experienced just in the world at large as queer people. And one of the biggest ways that this occurred was having the onus of education falling on them rather than on the therapist. Participant 1 talks about this as, I have to be the one to explain, I have to be the one to be patient. And then went on to express like the exhaustion that came with that and the familiarity of that role. The next theme is client perceptions of the therapist. So participants talked about trying to sense the sociocultural and political location of their therapist. They talked about looking for shared identity markers with themselves as ways of assessing the potential safety to disclose their queer identities. Prior to like an incident of a harmful incident, the feelings towards the therapist ranged from really liking that person to already really disliking them. But then certainly as harm occurred, those feelings tend to turn more negative. The lack of knowledge and tools came up a lot. Folks felt that their therapists were unaware and uneducated to all things queer. They spoke about the therapist being unequipped. In participant one's words, they said, it didn't feel like I could be guided. And then another aspect of this lack of knowledge was therapists being unfamiliar with relevant language. Participant 4 said that their therapist wasn't even familiar with basic terminology. Folks also describe their therapists as being uncaring, cold, and detached. And they also spoke about the ways that they could recognize their therapists as having good intentions and not necessarily trying to be harmful. In fact, at times even trying to be helpful or be understanding, but still causing harm in that moment. Impact on the client and therapeutic process. The participants mentioned finding this experience damaging, and they also expressed ways that they had begun like doubting themselves and their needs as a result. Somewhat unsurprisingly, maybe, loss of trust was a big repercussion. And this was loss of trust in that therapeutic relationship. People also talked about specifically the fact that the breach of trust came from an unexpected source, someone that they had thought that they could trust. So participant one shared, I was like, if she could react like that after 3 years of building rapport and being so vulnerable with her, it was kind of like I wondered what she could be capable of. What else could she say and how else could she respond to me in a way that could be even worse? And then another aspect of this loss of trust was loss of trust in the therapy process as a whole. So that person that I just quoted at the time of our interview had not yet sought out therapy with a new therapist and mentioned that they weren't sure if they could ever build the same level of trust with any therapist again. It's heavy. And all this led to ineffective and inefficient therapy. So participants too mentioned that their therapeutic outcomes took a lot longer to achieve, and the process was a lot more difficult trying to work with someone that they had this experience with. And then all 4 participants reported having terminated the relationship because of the harmful occurrence. The next theme, barriers to accessing therapy. The first sub-theme under this one of having a choice in therapist speaks to the ways that folks weren't always able to have a choice in who they were working with, and or the choice of people they had was limited. So at times that was because they were a minor and their parents were choosing who their therapist was. At times it was because of financial and insurance limitations. And then multiple people mentioned also using like the LGBTQ friendly filter when searching for a therapist, as trying to find someone that may potentially be safer, but how that also just like narrowed the pool of therapists even further. And then an additional layer of challenges kind of speaks to the way that therapy can already be a difficult resource to access, and having this need to like assess for safety or wondering how queerness will be received makes that more difficult. So participant 3 says, a lot of people who aren't queer probably feel like therapy is a very vulnerable experience. But for me, adding in the layer of like, hey, is this person going to freak out because I tell them I'm trans? It's just another thing to deal with. And the last theme was what builds safety and trust. So this is broken down into self-awareness, knowledge, and skills. For self-awareness, an important piece of this was needing a therapist who is at least as far along, if not further along, in their stages of identity development, thinking about queerness, that's specifically in terms of gender and sexuality. People also mentioned a need for the therapist to take initiative in educating themselves rather than relying on the client to do so. Under knowledge, there is a lot of need for more culturally relevant knowledge, but one aspect of that specifically that people mentioned was an engagement with culture. So having therapists that are actually, in participant three's words, going out of their way to engage with trans, genderqueer, non-binary people, and even like social media content. And a few other aspects of knowledge that people mentioned as important were sensory-friendly environments and connections to culturally relevant resources. And then for skills, a lot of these related to navigating missteps when harm occurs. So this includes being able to receive feedback and still hold therapeutic space, believing clients' experiences of harm, and showing humanity. participant one kind of offers some guidance on this that I thought was well said. As therapists, you should be mindful of the fact that you're capable of doing harm, and that's going to happen because you're a human being. When we see other human beings just being human beings, that makes me feel like, all right, this person's not going to tell me that they're never going to hurt me, they're never going to harm me, but they're going to do their best. And then just a few other like skills that came up were allowing space for the queering of identities, not putting people in boxes, asking about previous therapy experiences, and using correct name and pronouns. So those are all the findings. And then relating them back to my research questions, when looking at like how people have experienced harm in therapy, one of my biggest takeaways was how it could come from any therapist. So when people were trying to assess sociocultural and political location, the therapists that had harmed them were people that they had read as being either conservative or liberal, as being religious or not, as someone they'd worked with for a while or had just started working with. This also aligns well with McSorley's finding in the gender microaggressions that harm can come from within the marginalized community, as one of the harmful therapists in this study was a member of the queer community. And then thinking about the therapist behavior attitude that caused harm, I kind of kept coming back to this sub-theme of therapy replicating systems of privilege and oppression. Sort of all of the actual behaviors or attitudes were things that are somewhat classic forms of cis heterosexism and things that these people are encountering already out in the world. And I think this kind of just demonstrates the need for more sociocultural awareness, for more understanding of how systems of privilege and oppression work, and how they operate in our lives and in our identities as a way of preventing harm. And then looking at the effect of the harm on the client and the therapeutic relationship and process, it was somewhat hard to hear about people internalizing the cis heterosexism of their therapists, and also just the way that it kind of rendered therapy ineffective, and also made it a much less accessible resource to these folks that were seeking out something that they have every right to access. So implications for clinical practice. I think the sort of gravity of what people discuss as happening really necessitates the cultivating of sociocultural reflexivity and like these skills for navigating missteps as really needing to be prioritized in our profession, in our education and training. I also think seeking out supervision when working with queer clients is important. And then I provided in the written thesis some questions to prompt some like identity development around gender and sexuality, seeing as that was also an important piece of what can help build safety and trust. Limitations of this study, as I mentioned before, the demographic diversity in the participants was significantly limited. And then there's also shared locations between myself and my advisor that could lead to not only just a lack of representation, but some gaps of knowledge. And then looking into future research, I think addressing some of that demographic diversity would be a good place to start. And then looking at discrepancies between clients and therapists' experiences, especially given the way that harm hasn't really been talked about from therapist perspectives, but when we're asking clients, they are bringing it up. Looking at positive therapy experiences for queer clients and what helps facilitate those. And then more just of personal interest, I think looking at the role that community resources play in the lives of queer people and how those community relationships can be models for liberatory therapy practice, or what like a liberatory therapeutic relationship can look like. And that does it.
Great.
Oh, how do I?
I'm trying to, how do we stop you from sharing?
I don't know. I mean, hold on.
I think is it on Jess's computer?
Yeah, but I can't get the like full Zoom thing back, to get the little bar. Oh, there it is. There it is.
Go. Yeah, there it is.
Cool, cool.
There you are. Okay, well done. Nice and pretty close to your limit of 20 minutes. So well done with that. I would like to turn it over to the two readers, and perhaps we can start with Jay. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Lovely to see your face.
Yeah, you too. It's been a minute. And you, Jess. Really good
Yeah,
to
you
see.
too.
Thank you for the study. I when I started reading it, I was just immediately thinking about how important the study is, because especially the focus on client perspectives and getting client voices in the mix. I think especially in music therapy, we sometimes are more defensive as a profession than we are like open to this type of thing. And a lot of what you talk about, I've seen repeatedly. Like I've seen other therapists in music therapy and outside engage in like this type of harmful thinking, and I know a lot of people who've been harmed by it. So I don't have like a ton. I mean, I only got to read it one time, so I don't have like a ton of critique. Are you looking for like questions, comments? Like I have some things I could say, but just like kind of say whatever.
Yeah, sure. Just any kind of question or comment that you have, it's good.
Okay. One thing about like that I was noticing only a few times in your writing, and I can give you a specific time when you were in the research design section, ontology and epistemology. Oops, I lost you. Hold on. Where you say like, I believe this, and I kind of wanted stronger language, like what you are saying is true, like this is it, rather than I believe this. So like, I believe that we come to know what we know through the lens of cis heteronormativity as well as other systems of oppression. Like that is true, right? So like I think like just like some like look through the whole thing and just like find where your language could be a little bit more like, yes, like this is accurate and true. And I really appreciated your questions at the end a lot. I think those are really great and really important. And I was wondering if, I don't know if you consider this relevant to the study or not, but if you got any feedback or any insight into why such limited participation when you were seeking participants.
That's a good question. I didn't like receive any concrete information around that. I think I know one of the challenges we ran into is finding ways to access clients, like without like HIPAA violations or like things like that. Yeah, it's just, I think it's a lot easier to get therapists to respond. In fact, some of these participants are therapists, but they were just talking about also their experiences as clients. So yeah, that's all I know for sure. But
yeah, I wonder if it could be just powerful to include like the vulnerability of sharing these experiences as maybe part of why it was limited, or some, even if it's just like reflections, that could be important aspect to just include a couple of sentences on. And then I was wondering if the therapists being talked about, if they were all like verbal psychotherapists, or any of these music therapists, do you know?
None of them were music therapists.
Okay.
Yeah, I think they were all verbal.
Okay, maybe worth specifying or not. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, one of the difficulties I want to sort of add to that a little bit is that we were thinking that it would be good to find clients of music therapists, But then thinking, how do you ask music therapists for client lists of people that might have found them harmful? Like, it's just a really weird.
Yeah, very hard. I feel like you have to be lucky to just, not lucky, unfortunate, but also like find someone who just had a music therapist that harmed them. Yeah. And then one other thing, it sounds like one of your participants was a minor when they were harmed. Is that right?
Yeah.
And I was just, I mean, this could just be like a future research thing, but like, I can imagine that there's like a difference in the harm caused when you're a minor versus when you're an adult. And the implications or the consequences of that. But yeah,
Absolutely.
probably not. It's too much to include in the study. So yeah, but amazing job. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Timothy.
Thank you, Jess. What a wonderful job. You are the expert in this area now, right? And so we're here just to read and to glean from the work that you've done. And thank you for starting to contribute to the literature in this area. It's interesting, like a lot of my research is really on culturally responsiveness and culturally relevant pedagogies, and it's really neat to see the similarities and findings. It basically is, I hate to say I'm not shocked at any of the findings, right? I hate to, you know, but it's neat to see the similarities in what our founders like Gloria Billings has started, you know, years ago, right? But to see the specifics in what you were calling the congruent ways of pedagogy for queer theory. So it's really neat. I left you a bunch of edits that you can read, you know, in comments. I really, my view of reading this is I want it to be published, right? So all of my edits are just, hey, if you're going to publish this, I would consider doing these small things. One thing, did you find it difficult, and or can you share a little bit of your experience if you had to address your own bias in writing this, in working with your participants? How did you remain unaffected? I hate saying that, but you know, because at this point you are the researcher, right? And your feelings really cannot come into play when you're trying to tell the story of someone else. How did you deal with that? Or did you have an issue? Like, I'm just curious.
I think in the moments that I felt that coming up is definitely when I was utilizing journaling. Like, I think I might have said I did it kind of intermittently. I'm not a big journaler personally, but I could feel at times like something would immediately jump out at me from someone's like transcription. And it's because like I know that experience as a queer person. Like, I'm like, oh yes, I hate that, you know, or like whatever. And then I similarly, like the moments where I was like, that doesn't seem as strong, you know, then I feel like those are kind of the things I just sat with and were like, why am I having this reaction for myself? And like had a space to kind of just explore that for myself, and then kind of come back to be like, this is significant to this person's experience. And I don't know if this is, I think like the member checking too, even though I actually didn't really receive much feedback from my participants, but I think just knowing that like I felt accountable to them and I was going to be sending them and saying, this is what I took from your words and your story, I found helpful in that process. But I don't know, it also feels like a fine balance of like, I mean, of course, these are these people's stories and their experience of them is what I want to honor. And my experience as a queer person also informs me in understanding that. So I don't know, I guess it was trying to balance those things.
Yeah. You, again, if you do decide to publish, you may want to add a little section of possible bias, and or that you acknowledge that you have a bias toward this, and not, I'm saying the word bias, but that what you did to navigate that, and or how you use that, your personal experience in the interpretation of the findings. Just you know, just some ways. I would also consider using some words like when you talk about your process and method of trustworthiness.
Mm-hmm.
like use some of those words if you want to, so that again, if it's going to be published, you want to use some of those things, and maybe be specific on the sampling. Dr. Hadley, would this be considered judgment sampling or representation sampling? You may want to just find a way to include that in this study if it's going to be published, but talk to your advisor about that. Dr. Hadley, what do you think? I was trying to figure out which one it would be.
Well, the thing is that there was very little choice that we had given the few
Yeah.
people that actually so it was almost like, what would it be?
I thought it would be on the lines of convenience, but
Yes.
but you did say no to some people, so then that really, so anyways, just find ways to be clear in that, so that your readers know exactly what was there. I had one thing I wanted you, I wanted you to talk about it. It was the last. Given the gravity of this findings, and it's important for music therapists working with clear clients to seek out supervision with supervisors. That whole portion, can you talk about that? Because I got what you were saying, but I just wanted to hear you talk about it because I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean that I think my understanding of that part is the way that relates to like stages of identity development. So I would yeah, I think like it almost sounds a little weird when saying you should seek out someone that has a similar standpoint as you. But I think it's trying to say that person needs to be at least as aware of this aspect of their identity and how it's impacting them everywhere, and like how they show up in this context, like in therapy or in supervision too, in order for them to like be able to actually supervise you, to be that further along, like guiding person. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
I just you want to be, I would, as you're writing, navigate how, because what you're saying is true, but words mean everything, right? And so like, because you're navigating between cultural competency and cultural humility, which are two different, they're the same thing but different on angles. And so you want to you just want to be careful on how you say that. And if you want to talk later about that, we can talk about it for hours, right? So that just because a person identifies in an era, they may not have their cultural competency because maybe they lived a double life for so long, or they've been having to be oppressed, so we got to figure out how to say that. But I love what you're saying, but just, words would count there. I think that's all I have. Again, I left you a bunch of notes that you can take or not take. Also, when you are, this is just like a technical thing. I'm gonna share my screen. When you quote people, you may want to talk with your advisor. It'd be cool if you separated it out, because here, I'll show you. Let me give you an example. Here, like I'll just pull up my last article. Right, yeah. Something like this, where you actually have them out as opposed to in the paragraph. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because I think just visually, the reader already sees that person as somebody now, and it's a small thing, but like, because as you're reading, it was hard to differentiate 1 and 2 when it was in the paragraph. This is just like a technical thing. I don't know what Dr. Haley wanted you to do with the formatting, but just those things, when you quote them and they're out, I automatically am like, okay, that's person 1. I know what there's, it just, it's like a visual thing. But if you have any questions about my comments, I left a lot. Please reach out. I love this work, and I want to see more of this literature, right? I want people to be quoting you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So that's an outsider perspective from music therapy, so that's good. Because we've done this in a lovely short amount of time, I'd like to open it also up to some of your friends who may want to make any little comment or anything. That's Ray and Sky, if you're not sure who you are.
I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but you know I will. I'm super, super excited to. I'm driving, sorry. Super excited to read it. So proud of you. I am super impressed by your ability to share this really complex work in a concise and clear way. And it's just so important. And I've learned so much from you over the past 3 years. And know that you will continue to be a person in my life that helps me to learn and grow and holds me accountable to that. And that's really important to me. So I'm proud of you and proud of your work. And you did it. Yay.
Thank you, Sky.
Both did it today.
You both did it. I'm sorry I missed Sky's, by the way. Congrats to Sky.
Thank you
and-
so much.
Yeah. And congrats to Jess. Jess! I'm so excited. I'm so excited that you did this and you got through it. Like, I know you were struggling to find that sample. And I was actually like, was really appreciating some of the other questions that were brought up. My mind was like going just with the different avenues that I've been down, and I'm finding a lot of like your work resonating with things that I resonate with, and that's not surprising to me at all. And I love that that's come through. One thing that I found myself thinking about is like this grappling with, I find it interesting and like kind of an emergence of the systems that you're talking about, that it was so hard to find people and participants, the way that like harm is obfuscated, and the way that there's just really not any lines of like accountability for clinicians to actually like document and like go through reparations if they do, if you know, there's no infrastructure for that. There's no way of actually like, obviously we don't need a roster, we don't need to create more check marks and all that crap, but like it's just it's interesting how the lack of infrastructural recognition for the need for reparations and accountability has coalesced in like this struggle to find people to document the need for reparations and structure. Like it's like the whole cart before the horse situation. And so I don't know, that's just something that came up that seemed like important to express. If there was any other thoughts that like come from that, like great. But that's just something that I found myself like considering, just the nature of epistemic ignorance and epistemic injustice, and how that the limiting of our imagination and our even our words for describing like what we're experiencing or what we're feeling, or how that like creates its own problems and creates its own, like it's yeah, I'm not going to keep rambling, but I love the way that this study kind of opened up a lot of those questions. And it would be nice and interesting to see like if that's not written in it. I think that's important to write about and to explicate somehow, like in like this, in trying to create language or frame like this process of finding people to participate. I'm sure it's probably in there already, and I would love to read this, by the way. So just whenever you're ready to share it with people, I'm totally down to read it. So that's that on that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I honestly feel like I didn't say a whole lot about recruitment in that aspect of like the difficulty of finding people. But I think all of you are bringing up a good point, because that was a real challenge. And I think what maybe even made this topic like, can it even be done initially? So yeah.
And like, what does that say for epistemic ignorance, and like the creation of how we know what we know, and who gets to say what we know, and who gets to create what we know? I mean, like if there becomes like so many borders around why something is studied and if something is founded or not founded. So yeah, I think it would be important to me.
It's making me think of your participant who took it upon themselves to like advocate to their therapist in order to like reduce the potential harm for future queer clients of that therapist. Like, I think that's such a common experience for people, because nobody feels like there's a way for therapists to be held accountable. Like it's really difficult in any therapy profession to like report somebody, or like you don't want to report them because you feel like they shouldn't lose their license, but maybe they should not work with queer clients. Like, it's this like super fine line. But there are a couple of things, like that was one of them in particular that like, whew, like made me feel really like that's just really awful and sad.
Jess,
I don't know if this is helpful to add to the conversation. Sorry, Timothy, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just going to also share that like one thing that came up for me when you were talking about recruitment is that like I don't know that I would ever like I still very much struggle with like never feeling queer enough to be responding to anything about being queer. So like I don't think that I would ever probably offer to like speak about my experiences of harm in therapy and like my exploration of my identity and how that could be harmed in therapy has probably not gone deep enough to really like understand that. So I'm guessing that there are probably people that have had the experience too that are just not I don't know, haven't engaged in some of that like reflexivity about that piece of their identity or identity in general in therapy. Like for me, it's just, I, never feel queer enough for talking about it. So anyways, that's just another layer.
Yeah, for sure.
One question. Did besides the 2 Facebook groups that you posted to, were the other groups specific to music therapy or therapy in
No,
general?
they were just like community organizations. Yeah.
And is there research out of non-music therapy, just therapy in general, queer experiences, or is okay? I was curious about that. I was like, I wonder how they're parallel or not. Be interesting.
In terms of findings, there was definitely a lot of overlap, although I actually hadn't even thought to like revisit what they said about the recruitment process. But I think that would be interesting to go back to now.
Right. And or maybe a future step, like how does music play into what you're doing now? Or to what your findings and recommendations are. I'd be curious. I'm the oddball, I'm the musician part of it, but seriously, like what you all do is so important, and we have a tool of music. So like I'm curious, like could that play? And I don't have the answer. But it'd be neat to ask, like, well, what is the medium of music? How does that help with skills, with communication, with building a knowledge base? I'm just curious. I don't know. I'm just now I want to get on board and do some research.
But it also I think adds to the harm, because often the music that people use is either it can be very promoting of cis heteronormativity in so many ways that it can actually be harmful. Depending on how it's used. But I also think that, and I wonder, just given that this was all happening, in the midst of, toward the end of all of the stuff happening with COVID, but also all of this, the increased political action against queer and trans folk and issues in various parts of the country, that maybe some people felt exhausted and not wanting to be vulnerable in that space, to talk about harm when they're experiencing it everywhere. So I don't know whether that could have played a role as well.
I feel like, sorry to interrupt again. I feel like to add to that, there's, because of the way that knowledge and like what is sufficient enough to be knowledge is so bordered in a lot of this academic research, on the ground, like in communities, there's so much known and so much like already kind of grappled with that there is also just a critique on this focus on harm, you know, like this focus on trans pain, on queer pain, and making that like the monolith myth. And I know that's like not the intention of the study, but the fact that like studies in like our specifically in our profession have not even addressed harm, but like outside in the communities, people are like, get past harm, get past it. It's just like, we're not even to the point where we're talking about like harm and what it is and how to repair. And like out in the world, people are like, we need to get past this. We need to like go through this and attend to other more important things. And so, again, like it's almost like the way this finding of participants seems to be dampened by the very reasons why you're trying to do the study.
Yeah, I know we're out of time, but one last thing. I honestly, and I'm making you do work now, but how did the pandemic change therapy? Yeah, all around, more Zoom. So not only am I in therapy, I have to look at a camera and see my face now and my reaction, you know, or I can control my reaction now, my true feelings, because I'm looking at myself. And so I'm really wondering how that has an impact on harm, receiving of therapy, giving of therapy. We're no longer in person most of the time. Like look at us now. If we were in a room together, we would have a whole different experience now, you know. So I'm not to take away from that, but that has to have an impact. This is really interesting. You got my mind thinking now.
Well, given that you do have to go back to work, Jess, and that
I just clocked back in. It's cool.
I'm so sorry about all of that. I just want to congratulate you on getting this done and really running towards that finish line at the end. I'm glad that you got to do it before I go away and didn't have to wait until later, so that you can just enjoy your summer. And thank you so much I really can't thank you both enough for doing this under such short time constraints. It is an unbelievable ask, and you were both fantastic. So thank you so much for doing
Yes, thank you.
You're very welcome. It's an important study, so I was very happy to do it.
And I was hoping to see the little one, but
Got taken away.
I
I didn't want her to be a distraction.
I'll deal with Facebook. So, all right. Well, take care, everybody, and congratulations again, Jess.
Thank you.
Sue, if you could stay on for a second.
Congratulations.